Some people just move really far out. And there are some parts that are more or less affordable than others based on how far out you are and how inconvenient the train is.
In this week's episode of the Mixtape, I had the pleasure of interviewing Dr. Anna Stansbury, an assistant professor at MIT's Work and Organization Studies Department. Anna is a PhD economist working at the intersection of two fields, macroeconomics and labor economics. And in our interview, we did basically two things. I learned more about her personal story, where she came from, how she got where she is, and I learned more about her thoughts and ideas about what's going on with workers in the United States today. Anna grew up in England. Her parents were both lawyers who ended up leaving their professions to go work on problems with corruption in the construction industry. And I don't think I was reading too much into it to see this theme of interest in social justice in her parents, as well as how Anna has what appears to be sort of sorted into that herself. She came to the United States after graduating from Cambridge University with a degree in economics to study at Harvard Kennedy School's Masters of Public Policy program. Rather than going into something directly related to public policy, though, she stayed at Harvard and got her PhD in economics because, in her own words, she wanted to have impact and realized that she could do that best as an academic economist. This is not an unusual motivation at all within economics in my experience. If you go back and listen to my interview with Susan Athey from earlier this year, you will hear many types of similar things with what Susan said drew her to economics too. But Susan and Anna, while they specialize in different areas within economics, they're very similar in that they think economics can help improve the world, and because they want to improve the world, they decided to become an economist. I know of Anna only from arm's length. We follow each other on Twitter and are part of a larger network dubbed #EconTwitter. This is our first time to actually talk. And in preparing for the talk, I realized I read through a bunch of her papers, kind of at a topical level, but the more I began to read them, the more intrigued I was by her research, and decided to start an independent readings this semester with a PhD student to go through her labor papers, as well as a bunch of other papers that I've been meaning to read. She works in topics in labor that I think are really critically important, that if you kind of if you're paying attention in labor, you're watching kind of this resurgence of interest in an area called monopsony, as well as just issues regarding policies that can help workers. The overall well-being of workers is clearly something that Anna is very interested in. And the overall well-being of workers is not just simply about employment, but it's also about real income. And the reason why real income is really important, wages in particular, is really important, is because most Americans, most people in the world buy goods and services which go into their lives to make their lives better using their wages. They don't use profits from a firm that they own, and they don't use dividends from capital or stocks or savings or anything like that. They're workers. Many of them live paycheck to paycheck, very low savings, trying to make ends meet. She's a part of large of a group of people active in labor economics that's kind of forced me to really go back and look more closely at my priors about the role that minimum wages may or may not be playing in helping workers, the role that unions have traditionally played in helping workers, whether these things are effective policies or not, and also just making me realize again that the gains from trade that happen between the worker and the employer are not always distributed the same over time. It's a bunch of puzzles that Anna kind of has pointed to that's made me really want to go back to the books and the drawing board and think more deeply about what exactly is going on with workers and the labor markets and the product markets over time, to start thinking through what policies may be helpful. Talking with Anna was great. I'm going to be spending the fall reading more of her papers. Highly encourage you do too. Hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thanks so much. My name is Scott Cunningham, and this is Mixtape Podcast. Okay, it is my pleasure to have Dr. Anna Stansbury on the podcast this week. Anna, thank you so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Well, before we start, can you just tell me, for the sake of the reader, your name, your title, and where you're employed?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm Anna Stansbury. I'm an assistant professor of work and organization studies at MIT Sloan School of Management. And I'm part of IWER at MIT, which is the Institute for Work and Employment Research. So it's a sort of interdisciplinary group of scholars studying issues to do with work and economic inequality as it relates to work, employment relations.
Oh, okay, cool. All right. Well, let's start with an icebreaker. All right.
Great.
So, what was the first concert that you ever attended? How old were you? And who'd you go with when you went?
So that's a hard question, the first one ever. And I don't know if I remember the first one ever, which maybe says more about me. But an early concert I went to, which I remember, was Battle of the Bands at high school. So I was at school during the kind of indie emo era. And so everyone who was anyone was in some kind of an amateur indie rock band. So we would have these Battle of the Bands when we were 12 or 13. And if you were in a band, you got to be very cool and be on stage. And if you weren't in a band, you were sort of in the mosh pit wearing your black and pink stripy pullover or whatever it was we wore. So I remember that one very vividly.
That's awesome. Wait, were you in a band or were you in the mosh pit?
I was not. I was in the mosh pit.
You're in the mosh pit. That's awesome. My first one was Van Halen,
Oh,
the
cool.
For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge tour. They came to Memphis, Tennessee, and it was in Memphis had just built this massive pyramid downtown on the river, on the Mississippi River. And so I got to see Van Halen. I did not like Van Halen though. So I was in this thing where I was unfortunate. All my friends liked heavy metal, and I only liked the Smiths and the Cure and REM. And so, but of course, like they don't tour because they're from the 80s and it's in so anyway, but it was still a lot of fun. It was fun in a different way. It was fun because you were with your friends.
Yeah, as an experience, right? Having seen Van Halen as an experience.
Yeah, totally. So tell me, where did you grow up?
I grew up in Buckinghamshire, which is kind of when I'm talking to non-British people, I say London, but any real Londoner listening would be really upset if I said London, so I won't. So it's kind of between London and Oxford in the UK, in the countryside, but still close enough to the city that we sort of, feel part of the London world more generally. But I mean, I grew up next to a farm, so it was very countryside-y.
Oh, yeah. Wow. What did your parents do?
My parents run an anti-corruption nonprofit together in construction. Yeah, so they focus on preventing corruption in all its forms, fraud, bribery, extortion, everything else in the construction infrastructure sector worldwide. So I grew up with a lot of discussion of bribery at the dinner table.
Oh, wow. Huh.
Yeah.
What are they like? How did they get into something like that?
They were lawyers. My mom worked as a lawyer, as a litigator in construction, and my dad was trained as a lawyer and then worked in-house for, big engineering and construction companies. And they met when they were both doing that, and they were actually doing that in Hong Kong. Oh. And I guess at some point decided that it was time to transition, and having been in that world for a long time, had seen or heard of a lot of, not seen directly, but, heard of, been in the world of, and understood how nefarious behavior can happen in these big projects, because big construction projects, there's so much money going around and there's so much scope for problems. The classic examples being you're a government procuring a massive power station or a massive bridge. There's so many opportunities for a small bribe here or there as to which contractor gets the gig, or whether you approve a project that shouldn't really have been approved, or the safety standards are relaxed and bribes change hands. And those are the kinds of things that, where there's a lot of scope. So my parents, having been in that sector for many years, sort of understood how it worked and thought that this was an area that really needs to be tackled. So in the early 2000s, they quit that and went for the anti-corruption stuff.
Wow, that's crazy. I didn't even really think about that. Huh. That's a whole other conversation. That's really
Yeah.
so you grew up in the country.
Yeah. Yep.
Oh, okay. What was that like? Did you enjoy that?
Yeah, I mean, I loved it. I feel like it's a different thing in the English countryside near London than it would be in the kind of proper countryside, because I was still
Mm,
near enough a city, like we were on the train and I could get the train into London in an hour.
I
And so
see.
that's a very different experience than being very far from everything. But I really liked it. It was a kind of nice mix of, you've got quite a, you know, sheltered existence. You can spend a lot of time outside. You can spend a lot of time doing sports.
Mm,
I used to do a lot of running, so I did a lot of cross country running.
mm,
Um, but you've still got the city there when you want to go to the movies or go out with friends or feel like you're having a bit of an adult life as a
yeah,
teenager.
yeah. And I grew up in Mississippi, which is
Oh yeah.
quote the country, but I have a feeling it was very different.
Yeah. What was it like for
It's
you?
probably a little more. Yeah, it's interesting. So like I guess where you grew up is almost like a suburb of London, but it's like rural.
Well, so actually that's a great point. So in London we have the Green Belt, which is in the 50s, I think, but I could be wrong on the timing. They legislated that no new development could happen in a circle around London, which they called the Green
Oh,
Belt. And it was in order to prevent urban sprawl. But what it really meant is that we have a very dense city and then I guess a suburban ring, which is quite countrysidey and full of farms and parks and woodlands and things,
huh.
and then more building around the outside of that.
But they
So
don't. It doesn't get suburbanized the way that like
it's
America.
not allowed to. It's got incredibly strict planning
Oh,
restrictions. And one of the big debates in policy in the UK at the moment is whether to relax that. Should we be able to
oh.
build in the green belt? Yeah, but right now you're not allowed to. And so that's how I grew up in a house by quite a large town, but next to a farm.
What's that? What did that do to housing prices in those areas?
Oh, yeah, no, not good.
They're
Not good. I
high.
mean,
They're super
they're
high.
super high. I mean, in London for sure, and then even in the areas outside of London, just because we've had incredibly restrictive house building out, you can't sprawl, but we also have really restrictive house building restrictions up. So you can't go to
Mm,
Hall in London in almost any places because there are very strict restrictions on skylines and on shadow. Tall buildings cast shadow onto other buildings, and you're not allowed to do that without a lot of
mm,
approval. So house prices are astronomically high as a result
mm.
of these restrictions. Yeah.
Oh, so where do people go? I mean, how does a how does a lower income person survive in London if they can't even move far away on the train line?
Yeah, it's not good
It's
in
hard.
some. So there's
Yeah.
some affordable housing, but not enough. Some
Mm,
people just move really far out. And there are some parts that are more or less affordable than others based on how far out you are and how inconvenient the train is. But it's funny, I'm actually doing some work right now on regional economic inequality in the UK. And
mm,
one of the aspects we're looking at is pay premium in London versus in other parts of the country. And we find that there's a big London pay premium, even for lower income people of the same kind of qualification level relative to the rest of the country, but that's completely eroded by housing costs. So there's
oh,
there's actually a net financial
right.
disadvantage for living in London versus almost anywhere else in the country, unless you're in a really highly paid job.
You pay your compensation is higher in London. Your net compensation is lower.
Yeah, exactly. If you're a
Mm,
renter, if you're an owner, obviously it's very different because
yeah,
prices are not
if it's
very
a
much. But
renter,
if you're a
right?
renter, yeah.
You got that data over time? Has that changed over time?
We don't have it over a super long time series, unfortunately. I think we've only got it since about 2012, and you do see it worsening since 2012 because there's been a big increase in house prices. But ideally we'd have it for 40 years, and we don't have that yet.
Yeah, yeah. But it exists. You've got to make it. That data
We're
exists.
trying to figure this out right now.
Yeah.
Hopefully.
Okay. I don't want to take your project away. Right? Steal it.
No,
Tell
no, no,
me
you're
about
not taking it away. I'm just hesitating because I'm getting anxiety at the thought of whether it does exist because we do want to.
it. Well, so when you were a kid in high school, what would you have been doing? What were your hobbies that you enjoyed outside of academics?
Yeah, I did a lot of hobbies. I did a lot of sport, did a lot of music, and I did a lot of theater. So, like well, musical theater. So I don't know that's got a particular reputation in the US, but I was, in all the school musicals and in the orchestra and in the choir. And I did track and field hockey and netball, which is a British game like basketball, but you don't dribble.
Oh, you don't
Um,
do netball?
yeah, netball. It's a great game, and I really wish it was played more widely. But yeah, you just pass. So it's a very and then you pass and shoot. So it's basically very similar to basketball in that there are two nets and there's a ball, but you don't dribble.
Is there a professional league?
I think so, but only a few countries play. So there's definitely a national team in the UK, and there's a national team in a lot of other countries, primarily that were former British colonies, because I guess that's how the sport
You
spread.
don't have any layups. You probably don't have any layups.
No layups.
Right.
No, there are
You
like
have long shots. You have,
yeah, exactly.
Right.
Penalty shot type things.
Oh, that's interesting. So you can't move.
No, so you've got to just be.
It's almost like ultimate frisbee, almost.
Yeah, I think it is like ultimate frisbee with a ball. And obviously it can bounce the ball, so you can still catch it on a bounce.
Oh, you can pass it on a bounce. Oh,
yeah.
I see. Oh, that's interesting. Can you find it online? I guess you can find it on YouTube.
Yeah. It's a good game. It's fast.
I'll have to look on. I bet there's like 1,000 TikToks of netball. #netball. Okay.
TikTok. I haven't got that. No. Yeah.
Okay. Well, so what subjects did you what were your academic interests when you were in like your grade school, high school years?
So I was into languages quite a lot. I said a lot. I loved languages. So we had to, in England, everyone studies French pretty much in school. Everyone has to, because I guess because they're next door. And then my school also, you had to study another language. But then I did German, and then I also did some Spanish and did a bit of Italian and a tiny bit of Russian, which I've forgotten all of. But I love languages, so I did a lot of that. And also economics, honestly, from quite an early stage.
Really?
So we had in the UK, you take a set of exams at 16, which you take sort of 10 to 12 subjects at 16, and then you take only 3 or 4 subjects after 16, and those are the A levels, and economics was one of my A levels. So I loved economics, maths, and languages, and that's what I sort of specialized in.
Wait, so y'all had economics you had good economics in your high school?
It was really
your
good.
Teachers were good?
Yeah, not all schools offer it. My school had economics as one of the A levels. And actually, honestly, it formed a lot of how I thought about econ, because it was good. We did a lot of supply. It wasn't hard math. It was graphs. We did it graphically with graphical intuition, but it was good intuition. So we thought about perfect competition versus monopoly versus oligopoly. And, you have the different curves, and you think about deadweight loss, you think about price and marginal cost. We had a bunch of interesting macro. And I remember, because this was I was in this last 2 years of high school, 2008 to 10, which is obviously what a time to be studying macro, right?
Yeah.
It was the beginning of the Great Recession. It was the financial crisis. During this period, we had bank bailouts in the UK. We had the UK Chancellor talking about massive increases in government debt, which reversed the whole macro consensus of how much, what the debt to GDP ratio should be and what government should be spending on. So it was a really cool time to be studying it. And my teachers were really good at bringing it in and bringing in what's going on in the world and how should we think about that through the lens of what we're learning in our textbooks. It was a fun course.
Oh, that's cool. That's amazing. So did you go when you went to, so then you go to Cambridge, was economics immediately something that you were interested in?
It had to be, because in our system, you have to pick the subject you study before you go to university.
Oh, wow.
So we don't kind of choose our major when we're there. In almost all UK degrees, you apply with your subject already. So you apply in the fall of the year before you go to college. And that application, you've picked your subject and you've written an essay about your subject, and your teacher's recommendation or whatever is about your capacity.
Nobody can change their major?
It's hard.
Huh.
It's hard. So I'd applied to study economics already when I was 17. So I got to
any British economics major that I observe compared to an American economics major, I'm looking at someone that is known even before they started college.
Yeah. Yep. Has known even before they started college. And also for most economics degrees has only done economics.
Has only done economics.
Because you can't, in most unis, you can't take other courses, which I was quite frustrated about at Cambridge, because I wanted to get other perspectives, but it was very difficult to take a class from another department and have it count for credit. Wow. So you're doing, economic history, or you can do like the political economy, you can do the maths for economists, but you're within the economics department, you're within the framework of the economics degree your whole time.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really interesting, because the thing that I feel like I get really frustrated with, is that if you know that you're going, if you ever decide to get a PhD in economics, it almost really is better for somebody like you who knew from the very beginning, because they have to practically, get a math major,
Yeah.
and so many people, like I didn't learn about it. I didn't decide I wanted to become an economist until after I graduated college. And so,
Yeah.
it's just, it's great. It sounds great. You get all this fluidity to self-select, but for something like econ, that has so many fixed costs for graduate training, I bet, that kind of struck. I mean, I guess it's the whole thing is that a lot of people though in Britain just, they still don't know that they would love being an economist.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think it sort of cuts both ways, because I agree with you. The way the system works right now, it's not as it's a very windy path from undergrad to an econ PhD, especially with these courses that you have to have taken and got good grades in math, basically. And in the UK system, I think it cuts both ways. Econ is a very big major, so a lot of people will just take it, and then if you've done it, it's trained you quite well to apply for a PhD. At least, I mean, the one at Cambridge, for example, there was a lot of math. It was very mathematical. It was very theory heavy. And so it sort of trained you well that if you then decided in your third year of your degree, I want to do a PhD, you're quite well set up. On the other hand, if you didn't know about economics at 17 and didn't apply to take it, it's very unlikely that you'll ever be able to take it, because it's very unlikely that you'll shift majors once you're already at college. So there's a bit of, it cuts both ways there.
So which means the system has got to build a lot more of all these majors into high school.
I think so.
I mean, if you're having to do this for everything, then it seems like you've just got to somehow pump all of the different majors really earlier and earlier. I mean, are you like, what if you wanted to do like archaeology or anthropology? You graduated high school knowing just like you did it.
Yeah, you got to pick it. I know, it's funny. I mean, I like the US system's flexibility that you get to explore a little bit more before you specialize. Because for us, I mean, we already specialize at 16. You pick 3 or 4 A levels at 16. So you're already cutting off almost all of your other intellectual interests. So, I mean, it's good in the sense that if you know what you love, which I did, in retrospect, I would have liked to have done more science, but I didn't like it at the time. So I was like glad to stop it and just do history and econ and maths and languages. But if you are a bit more of a generalist or you're not sure what you like yet, it can be quite restrictive quite early.
Yeah. So you majored in econ. What'd you like? What were the classes that you liked at Cambridge? And which professors did you like? Who are some professors you remember really fondly?
Yeah. So my macro professor Petra Geratz was amazing. She is a Dutch macroeconomist at Cambridge who focuses on monetary policy and particularly central bank transparency. And she was one of my main professors, because at Cambridge we have lectures, but we also have tutorials, which are supervisions, which are small group sessions. So she was my macro supervisor for 3 years, and she was just incredibly good at drilling into kind of how macro works and thinking about the intuition. And she'd always say, don't describe it through the graph. Describe it as you would to your Aunt Betty, who doesn't know anything about graphs or derivations. And so she was really good at getting us to think about what is the intuition behind a fiscal stimulus, a monetary stimulus. How do we think about monetary policy and how it works? I feel like that just set the groundwork for me for years about how to think about macro. And another professor who I loved and whose class I loved was Victoria Bateman, who's an economic historian. So one of the unusual things about the Cambridge undergrad in econ is there's a mandatory economic history of the United Kingdom course in your first year. And it's from 1750 or something until 1939. So you have 3 blocks. You have kind of early industrial revolution, late industrial revolution up to World War I, and then the interwar period. And so you do so much interesting economic history. And Victoria Bateman was my supervisor for that course. And you're doing, why did the industrial revolution take off? Why in the UK, not elsewhere? How was it stimulated? And then you're doing in the interwar period, what happened at the Treaty of Versailles? Like what happened with the gold standard, international debt, defaults, globalization. So you get this amazing overview of kind of world economic history and the big debates. And that was just so fun as an 18-year-old to dive into.
Oh, I bet.
Yeah.
Oh, that was wonderful. Who are some of the famous, like, I feel embarrassed. Was Keynes at Cambridge?
James was at Cambridge. Yep.
Oh, that
There was a
must
lot
have
of,
been so neat to just like walk around where he was.
it was crazy. I know. And also my college at Cambridge was where Alfred Marshall was, who was, the founder of so much of modern economics. And then there was, people like Caldor and Hicks and Robinson, and is really had a lot of the great economists coming out of it, which was cool.
I bet that was neat. Just kind of feeling like, I bet taking a class like that, history of English economics, being in this school where all of these great economists had been, must be, I mean, I guess you get used to anything, but that still just seems really cool.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think, I look back at myself at 18 and think you should have appreciated a little bit more how unusual this was. Also, just being in a place that was 800 years old and being in I think you just sort of, you go, okay, this is cool. This is pretty.
Yeah.
And I wish I'd absorbed a little bit more what that weight of that history meant and how exciting it was. But it was amazing. Yeah.
Oh, that's cool. So then you leave. So then you So I take it macro, sounds like macro goes back kind of far. You've sort of been drawn to macro questions a little bit for a while.
Yeah.
But also was labor also stuff at Cambridge that you were finding yourself kind of drawn to?
That's a good question. I feel like that was a later interest of mine, honestly. I was always interested in macro because I was always interested in, well, really what drove my interest in economics from the beginning was being interested in questions of poverty and inequality and unemployment and fairness and those kinds of questions. So I was really interested in development for a long time, development economics. And I was interested in macro and finance, really very much shaped by the financial crisis being the defining event of my, like public social economic event of my teenage years.
Yeah.
So, you grow up reading about recessions and bank bailouts, and you see pictures of people taking their boxes of stuff out of Lehman Brothers after it went bankrupt. And this becomes what you're really interested in investigating. And then I think I got more into labor as I was thinking about inequality and unemployment and poverty in the context of advanced economies, particularly the US and the UK, and thinking about, well, how is this portion of inequality determined? Where do these massive gaps in pay for different groups come from? To what extent is this determined by the market? And that's how I sort of got more interested in that side of things.
Yeah. I mean, even sort of, I mean, I don't want to draw too much out of this, but I mean, it's like, even your parents being so interested in corruption. I mean, within a sector, I'm sure that you're thinking about, I mean, I guess like, it's like, that's not really consistent with perfect competition exactly, or it does call for, interventions, or like, it calls for people. It's interesting that your parents choose to go in and try to address that. I don't know. I mean, it just seems like kind of, I don't want to overstay it, but it's like I could see that kind of social justice ethos kind of in your story a little bit.
No, I think that's right. As I reflected on my kind of where I came from a little bit more, I think that's a big part of it. And a big part of it is a sort of skepticism in concentrations of power and belief in the power of society, civil society and government regulation to combat it somewhat, which probably is a bigger through line.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, I want to keep talking about that, but I got to save that stuff for in a minute. So then you end up taking a route into your PhD that is not as typical. You go to and get your master's of public policy at Harvard Kennedy School. Can you tell me why you ended up doing that? Did you know that you were going to end up doing a PhD eventually?
No.
Oh, okay.
So I never wanted to be an academic. It was just never on my radar as a career path. I don't know if it was on my radar because I didn't really know what it was like, or I didn't want to do it, but it just wasn't. I was always really interested in the public policy side of things, sort of going back to this justice, I guess, social justice type streak. So when I was at Cambridge, as well as, I mean, I studied economics because I wanted to make the world better. And I thought economics was a way we could understand how to do that. And then while I was at Cambridge, I was very involved in a student society called the Wilberforce Society, which is a student think tank. So we wrote, it's called Wilberforce. Yeah.
That's the guy that ended slavery in England.
Yeah, exactly. And he was a Cambridge alum. And so the people that founded this group named it after him as sort of someone that, thought a lot about important things and then did good things with it. So we were a student think tank. And so I spent a lot of time writing policy papers, trying to engage with policy and media on this stuff. And I really wanted to go into public policy, into some kind of job, maybe in government or maybe in a international organization, maybe doing some kind of thing in the private sector, but as a social enterprise or a social impact finance type thing. So I went to the Kennedy School with that in mind, thinking I love public policy. I have a very strong academic training in economics, and I feel like I would like to be complemented with more of the practical stuff, more politics, more soft skills, and that's what the MPP was going to offer. And also just getting the experience to live in the US and go to Harvard and meet people from all over the world. I mean, just seemed amazing. So I went straight there after my undergrad, thinking that I would do this 2-year master's and use that as an opportunity to explore different career options in probably international development, social impact stuff more broadly. But while I was at the Kennedy School, I did some of that exploration and loved it, but wasn't necessarily sure that those were my comparative advantage, I did some internships, I did some classes, and also ended up doing some econ classes with Ricardo Hausman, with Larry Summers, and loved them, and realized that maybe I should say,
What would it have looked like, do you think, if you would have said my comparative advantage is to sort of not be an academic, like at Kennedy School? What was it? What was it? What's the signal that you noticed that you weren't getting? That what would it have looked like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I don't know if maybe it was just my idiosyncratic experiences that didn't give me that signal. And if I'd have had different ones, I would have, gone in a completely different path. But I think for me, it was just that I hadn't found a day-to-day work set of tasks that I loved. I was quite happy to do a lot of the tasks that I was doing, but I didn't love it on a day-to-day basis. I also felt, and this was just me and just personal to me, but I also felt quite strongly that when I was doing some of my internships in international development, I was learning a lot, but I wasn't sure how much I was contributing. And I worried that that there's a surfeit of somewhat educated, well-intentioned people from rich countries who want to help, but maybe don't actually have that much to add relative to a lot of expertise in developing countries. And it's really that expertise and that local capacity that should be supported rather than piloting, flying in foreign experts. And I wasn't sure how I could fit into being part of the solution there. So that was kind of causing me to question how exactly I wanted to contribute and what exactly I wanted to do. And then I think I saw positive signals of my comparative advantage from taking econ classes and realizing that I loved the analytical process. I loved the kind of figuring out some big puzzle about the world and thinking it through. And I realized that I loved teaching because I was a teaching assistant and found that I loved that. And I had this moment when I was on my bike once. So I was biking home from being a teaching assistant. I was like, I love teaching. I love doing this. I was a research assistant for Larry Summers a little bit on a project on the UK. I love doing this research. I'm so interested. I wish there was a job that I could do this. And then realized there was. So
right.
So that sort of, helped reorient my career a little bit.
Yeah. I mean, I guess one of the signals that I just heard you say, which I don't think everybody, it is even meaningful to a lot of people, is this desire to have impact, right?
Yeah.
Like almost, I mean, some people would be like, impact, I don't know. I do it because I like it, or I do it because XYZ, but you're kind of wanting to have impact. Is that's what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, I think that's a good point. That's exactly. I wouldn't be doing this. I like the process, but I don't like it enough to do it on its own without a kind of a reason. For me, the reason is that I hope to have positive impact with my research and my teaching.
Yeah. Okay. So you're seeing some economists, because there's a bunch of economists that are teaching at Kennedy in the Masters of Public Policy, and two of them is Hausman, Ricardo Hausman. He's still alive. Is that right?
Yeah.
Okay. Ricardo Hausman, and then Larry Summers.
Yeah.
So you end up continuing. You end up having conversations with them or something kind of in those classes that is kind of pushing you forward a little bit.
Yeah. So I love the classes, and then honestly, Larry Summers was an amazing mentor to me. Still is, but like told me, essentially, he had this policy. He had a small seminar class at the time on, it was called Inside Government. It was sort of interesting economic policy topics in US government policy, financial crisis, auto bailout, health insurance, whatever they were.
Yeah.
And we would write essays for the class. I remember writing essays on advocating an 80% top marginal tax rate and advocating 4% inflation target. I don't know. I was feeling quite radical with my proposals, and I wrote these essays. And he had some policy of getting his TA to contact all the people that did well in the class and say, hey, why don't you have a meeting with Professor Summers? So if that contact hadn't happened, I wouldn't have ever met with him, because I'm not the kind of person that, and I wish I had been, that reaches out to professors to meet with them. So I did. I went and met with him, and, you know, as he did with all his students, chatted, what's your aspirations, what's your background, what do you hope to do? And he said to me, have you considered doing a PhD in economics? You know, you sound like you're well qualified for it, done what great in the class. And that suggestion planted the seed. And then he said, well, if you are interested in this, be my RA, be a TA for the class that I teach with Marty Feldstein and Jeff Liebman and Kate Baker, which was a great class that I ended up TAing a couple of years, and see if you like it.
Yeah.
So it was that intervention really that changed my trajectory.
Oh, wow. Wow. That's great. That's neat. So, so did Larry Summers become your advisor when you were at Harvard? So you end up going and getting your PhD at Harvard. How many years were you there?
Exactly. So I was 2 years in the MPP. Then I worked for a year as an RA and TA for Larry, for Ricardo Hausman, and for Marty Feldstein between my MPP and PhD. And then I did my PhD.
Team. Wow, that's really cool.
It was amazing. It was a wonderful year. Then I did my PhD 2016 to 21, so 5 years in the econ department. And Larry Summers and Larry Katz were my main advisors.
Oh, wow, that's great. So you just graduated.
Yeah, I graduated a year ago.
A year ago. So you've been at MIT a year. That's awesome.
Yeah.
So what did you end up writing your dissertation on?
My dissertation was on, it was called Essays on Power in Labor Markets, was the title. So I had 3 essays, and it was really all topics to do with kind of power and institutions. So one was a paper on employer concentration. So if there are few employers in a given labor market, how much does that suppress wages? Does that give them monopoly power? Second paper was with Larry Summers on the decline of worker power in the US and trying to quantify its macroeconomic implications.
Yeah.
And then the third paper was pivoting a little bit and was about minimum wages and union organizing protections and firms' incentives to comply with the law, basically, and thinking about how the financial penalties are applied in practice, and do they incentivize firms to break the law or comply with the law? Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Now that we're moving into research, this is great. I loved all of this, but this is perfect. I couldn't have planned it better. So, so here's what I was sort of thinking. You know, the major themes I was looking across your papers and reading through things is inequality in the labor markets appears to be a big part of it. Monopsony, the minimum wage, but then there's also this macro focus. I can't quite put it into words, so I'm hoping like that will be able to kind of, it'll be clear to me the way all these things work together as we're talking. But so this paper with Larry Summers, I don't want to summarize it because I in the past on the podcast have talked too much, but you've kind of got these, it seems like you start with some strange empirical regularities. I'm going to call them strange because you're going to explain them. Usually that's the way I always think of it. These empirical regularities between worker compensation, firm profitability over a 30-year period of time. Can you tell me a little bit about, before we even get into the explanation, there's a set of facts over a long stretch of time. What are they?
Yeah, absolutely. So the big facts that we're sort of trying to reconcile are, number one, a big rise in income inequality in the US since early 70s, early 80s, depending how you time it. One dimension of which is the decline in the labor share of income. So share of income going to workers is falling, share of income going to capital owners is rising. Fact number two is the rise in...
How big is it? How big is that change over 30 years?
Depending exactly how you measure it and from when you measure it, it could be about 5 percentage points of so our measure is the non-financial corporate sector compensation share. So we're just looking at the corporate non-financial private sector, basically. The share of compensation, the share of value added in compensation fell by about 5 percentage points from the early 1980s to the late 2010s.
Are real wages are rising, but the share is falling? I know
Yes,
there's a lot of heterogeneity,
yeah.
too, though. Okay.
So the share
Yeah, that's
falling
right.
would be the average real compensation hasn't kept up with total productivity.
Yeah. Right. Let me ask something. If you have rising labor productivity, can you also, just in a traditional neoclassical model, if you've got rising factor productivity in labor markets, could you get that decline in the share? Or is it guaranteed that it would also keep constant? It's something to do with the production function, right?
It's how you specify the production functions. So one of the Caldor facts was that kind of motivated our use of a Cobb-Douglas production function as the baseline, was that the shares of income of labor and capital had been roughly constant over the previous decades when he was sort of establishing the Caldor facts. And so in your Cobb-Douglas production function, the factor shares are set by the coefficients, k to the alpha, L to the 1 minus alpha. But if you have a production function which is, you can specify a production function where that's not the case, and the factor shares can change, and then they can change as a result of non-factor neutral technological change. So it could be that
non-factor neutral.
Yeah, as in technological change that augments one factor rather than the other. If you have a production function that's not Cobb-Douglas, then that can change the factor shares.
Okay. So you've got this. So number one, you've got workers are getting less of the total surplus associated with output. That's the way I think about it.
Exactly. That's fact number one.
You and I we got together, we make some gadget, we sell it on the market. It was historically 50-50, and now it's like 60-40.
Yeah.
And you're watching it fall.
And we're watching it fall. And the debate about how much it's fallen is pretty vibrant, but I think it's fallen at least a little bit. And it was pretty stable before that for a number of decades, really, since natural trends began in the 40s.
Yeah. So, Anna, is this a completely different debate than inequality? Before we get into the more of these stylized facts, like I usually think of inequality as just like the distribution of wages across the population, or like 1%, the 1% growing or something like that. But it seems like I haven't really thought as much about the capital labor shares.
Yeah, so I think when we talk about inequality, we're often talking about different aspects of the beast. So I like to think about it that there are two big picture inequality questions. One is within labor income inequality and how that's changed. And that's been huge because we've seen the rise of very top income earners in we've seen two dynamics going on within labor. We've seen the kind of college, non-college divergence, particularly in the 80s and 90s. And then we've also seen the top 1% or top X% of labor earners really skyrocket. Your chief executives and other top executives, your lawyers, your other professional service people. So those are the two within labor dynamics. And then you've also got the labor on average versus capital, which is mostly shareholders dynamics. And then you've got something going on with top 1% people, which is a bit of both. Because a lot of top 1% income is labor, but a lot of it is capital. Some of it is not entirely clear if it's labor or capital because they're an owner manager of a large company or they're a partner in a hedge fund, and how much of that is labor and how much is capital.
Well, now I can kind of see a little bit better, like all the things that macroeconomic theory is bringing into you, focusing on these labor questions. These all sound like I can see. I definitely see this like merging of the two fields in the way in the research.
I think so, and I think there's a lot of people doing really interesting work at this intersection because to understand any of the big social questions about what you do about labor markets, you need the general equilibrium, and the general equilibrium is what macro as a field is about. And so having that interplay is really important, I think.
Right. Okay, so falling labor shares, and then so what was the other other?
That's fact one, falling labor shares as a part of more broadly this rising inequality. Fact number two, rising corporate profitability and valuations. So ways you might measure that are without a corresponding rise in the kind of safe interest rate. So you've got rising stock market values, you've got Tobin's Q, which is a measure of the market value over the replacement value of capital rising. You've got corporate profitability as measured is rising relative to the safe rate of return. And you've also got this big stylized fact of rising markups that a lot of people were talking about and still are talking about in macro, in IO, where you've seen the markup of price over marginal cost for a lot of industries has risen. And so all of these are tied up in the same phenomenon of the rising profitability. And then the third set of facts was, and this is before the current era, was the decline in average unemployment in the US without any noticeable uptick in inflation. So
say that again. Say that one more time.
Decline in average unemployment without any noticeable uptick in inflation. So if you believe in some kind of theory of the world where there's a natural rate or a Nehru, you expect that low unemployment at some point will lead to higher inflation.
Kind of like almost like a kind of a Phillips-y type reasoning.
Exactly, like a kind of Phillips-type relationship. But we saw this big decline in average unemployment from the early 1980s to the late 2010s. And there was no meaningful inflation throughout the 2000s and 2010s. Now we're in a little bit of a different world. We can debate whether that's some other dynamic, but that was the third stylized fact.
We saw that declining employment because we saw a lot of male labor force participation rates falling. Is that not accurate?
Yes, so we're talking about the declining average unemployment rate.
Oh, unemployment rates.
But you're right that the employment rate dynamic muddies the waters a little bit. So you saw average unemployment in the 80s, 8-7%. You saw average unemployment by the late 2010s in the 3s and 4s.
Yeah.
But you did have this big decline in male employment at the same time. And so the question of whether that was concealing unemployment is an important one, but that's not what we're focused on.
So, okay. I keep interrupting you. Are there more facts? There's more, right?
No, those are
the ones. So, before we get into your explanation, so what the heck's going on? What do you have some opinions. So what is going on with this?
Yeah, so I'll frame it as there are a number of theories as to what explains each of these facts or these facts together. So if you're looking just at the labor share, the decline in labor share of income, some people attribute that to sort of technology and automation or a race between technology and education. Some people attribute it to globalization. Some people attribute it to rising corporate power. And some people attribute it to declining worker power. Those are the four big theories.
Could you get that with just like increased factor productivity of capital, like computers or something? Something that's just like, I don't know what exactly that would be, but like just sort of like exploding productivity of capital. Wouldn't that give you some of this? Like, you're seeing.
It depends. Yeah, under some production functions, and it depends on your assumption about that production function. Because again, if you've got a Cobb Douglas, then capital getting way more productive is actually also good for labor because the marginal product of labor is also higher. So it depends what you're assuming about the elasticity of substitution between labor and capital, essentially. Yeah. But yeah, there are some worlds in which that could be the driving force. Exactly. So there's a big debate about that. And then there is a number of papers that argue they take the labor share fact, declining labor share, then they also take the rising corporate profitability facts. And they say, look, this declining labor share stuff, this could be compatible with globalization, technological change, automation, all these sort of market forces type things that change the marginal product of different groups and therefore change their pay, right? That's essentially what it's saying. Change the marginal product of labor relative to capital. Under some assumptions about production functions, it changes their pay. Those are competitive explanations. But we've seen this big rise in profitability and markups and valuations that can't be explained competitively. Therefore, the explanation must be a rise in corporate power in product markets. Yeah. And we saw this big rise in corporate concentration over this period. The number of firms in a given industry has decreased. So maybe what's going on is market power and markups. And that's explaining the declining labor share because capitalists are, they're becoming more profitable because they're becoming more monopolistic.
Right.
And that's also explaining these profits. And so then our paper came in and said, actually, all these facts can be reconciled just as easily with a decline in worker power as it could with the rise in corporate power. But we think there's a whole bunch of other evidence that is more consistent with the decline in worker power than it is with the rise in corporate power. So we're sort of saying the focus on power is probably right, but we should be shifting our focus on power to the labor market side of things rather than the product market side of things.
Oh, so when you're talking about worker power, you are beginning to tap into the monopsony theory. You're saying other people were almost more focused on monopoly. And you're saying because because they were sort of saying is this monopoly issue that might be explaining some of this, and you're saying we think it's actually it's got elements of monopsony. Is that what you mean?
So almost, except that I'm a little wary about calling it exactly monopsony. And the reason for that is we definitely want to focus on the worker power side of things. And I think monopsony has a lot to do with it as a baseline characterization of the labor market. But I think even if you had a world where the labor market was not monopsonistic, it was some kind of perfectly competitive labor market, and you had a product market that was monopolistic, and the monopoly power didn't change in the product market, but there were strong unions in the past and the unions declined. You can imagine a world where, okay, past world was monopolistic product markets, generates lots of rents, lots of profits. And these profits, these monopoly profits are shared between unions and capital owners. Unions then decline. Nothing changes about the underlying monopoly power, but the rents go to capital. So that's not a monopsony story, but it's a kind of worker power story. So it could be that story, or it could be a monopsony story.
Oh, that's all I was kind of wondering. Is I actually didn't know how you move between the concentrated product market, and it wouldn't automatically imply some kind of symmetry in the input market. I don't know. It's so funny. It's like I feel like embarrassed. How much of micro I constantly am forgetting, as you like I don't know. It's like I taught it for 15 years, the grad micro, and it's like I just, it's so, so much of economics. You have to hold all this stuff simultaneously in your mind, how all these are working together. I just constantly am forgetting. So when I think about worker power, I always am thinking of it as like these old Nash bargaining models that I don't know how helpful they are, but I was just going to tell you, like, I always think about worker power in terms of like, well, if you don't pay me, I'm going to quit. And that's credible insofar as the employer can observe your outside option. And usually that is like the credible threat position. Is that at all going on here? There's some declining credible threat. Like, is it helpful to use? Is that a helpful way to think about any of this, or is that's not really helpful?
So I think it is, and I think I'm still open about exactly where the worker power is fitting in and which types of worker power fit in where. But I like the Nash bargain framework as a kind of intellectual architecture. I think there are two areas where worker power can fit into it. One is, well, actually, in some senses, three. One is if you've got the firm's outside option is the max they're willing to pay, right? The worker's outside option is the min they're willing to receive. And then maybe there's some surplus between the two. So one aspect that determines pay is the worker's outside option, and that could be getting worse or getting better, but that's the one you're talking about. If I don't get what I want, I quit, and the threshold at which I quit is my outside option. Then there's the firm outside option, which is how easy is it for the firm to replace me in some sense. And so I think one aspect of changing worker power that's been induced by automation and globalization is it's easier for firms to replace some kinds of workers than it was before. So the firm side option changes. And then if there's any surplus in the middle, that's where I think your things like union bargaining power matter. Because they might not affect your outside options, but they might affect how that surplus that's created by the match is split. So I think actually the Nash framework is quite useful just to think about which types of worker power fit where. And which ones have changed. And I think the surplus splitting power has clearly changed because unionization has declined so much. The firm outside option side may have changed as a result of technology and globalization. And then the worker outside option, I think it's not super clear if it's improved or got worse, because you could think of the rise of the internet and things as making job search easier. And
that's on my thing. It's my 14th question here.
No. Sorry.
Go ahead. No, keep going.
No, I mean, you can think about that as having made job search easier, right? Like it's much easier to find a good outside option now. If you can look on LinkedIn or look on one of these boards.
But it's not. Because that's what I was going to ask you, because you got this paper with Schubert and Tasca on employer concentration and outside options. So it says, I wrote down, it seems like your paper on employer concentration and outside options is actually getting at this worker power hypothesis. Is that, am I right?
So we're looking at the really the kind of monopsony outside option.
You're looking at the monopsony part.
If we're thinking about it being determined, these three portions, we're looking there at the what is happening to the workers outside option piece rather than the rent splitting piece induced by unions or something like that.
So this is exactly this is what I find so difficult to understand. Although honestly, I don't find it difficult to understand, but like I kind of feel like my reasons can't be the real, my personal reasons can't be the explanation. So like, so it, why is monopsony relevant if I can just move? Like, I don't understand this, like we talk about the labor market as though it's like this local area, but then when we have like platforms like LinkedIn, and the search costs for looking for a job, they seem like they're kind of low. I mean, maybe I'm completely wrong and they're like somehow LinkedIn has made it harder and there's all this congestion, but it's like it seems like it's like I know about jobs all the time.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I got Joe, I got LinkedIn, I got like a billion ways I hear about things. I got my network, all this internet stuff, and all I got to do is move to another place. Right? It's like, I mean, I had an opportunity to do that. I did not ultimately take it because of family stuff, but a lot of people, that's what they do. So why isn't all of this stuff making monopsony less relevant? Because I kind of get the feeling it's like either a bunch of economists are focusing on the wrong topic, but there's an awful lot of attention to monopsony going on.
Yeah.
So like, it seems like there's something going on. I'm just curious what you think about what you think about that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think this is a really big debate. And so on the point about moving, yes, like clearly people can move employers and they can move places. And so that must impose a limit on the degree to which a firm can suppress wages for any given worker. And the more mobile a worker is, the smaller that limit is. I think what I would say is what I think the bulk of empirical research is adding up to tell us is that even though search costs are relatively low, switching costs are relatively high.
It's the switching costs.
As you said, you're not going to move if it's hard to move if you've got family commitments. It's hard to move if you've got a mortgage. It's hard even to move employers if you've got a kind of care schedule that you need to switch around.
And that's changed over time. Like that's the part I don't understand. Is like some of this stuff feels like those are constants. So when you're telling me something's changing over time, and those are the explanations, I think, well, that's always been hard, right? It's harder now though.
This is where I was going to say the second point is I don't think monopsony has changed over time. I don't think there's any evidence to say it's got worse. I think, and my take on the labor market is very similar to a paper by Erickson and Mitchell in 2007, where they had a great explanation, which is that the decline in worker power has exposed the latent monopsony of the labor market. So there's some underlying nature of the labor market that is intrinsically kind of frictional, kind of monopsonistic. Yeah. That mobility allows you to move at a given degree, but there's a cost. And so between the salary and the cost of moving, there's some wiggle room for firms to exert some kind of monopsony power generated by these frictions and switching costs and search costs and everything else. I have no reason to believe that's changed much over time. You can construct some stories where non-competes and occupational licensing have made things more frictional. You can construct other stories where the internet has made things less frictional. So hard to say. I think it's a toss-up. But I think what has happened is, 40 years ago, a quarter of private sector workers were in unions, and a whole bunch others had a credible threat of being in unions. And there were other mechanisms that gave workers more bargaining power in their workplace and their firm. There hadn't been the fissuring of the workplace as much and all this kind of stuff. And so there was more formal and informal power for workers inside companies, which exerted a countervailing force to this underlying latent monopsony power. And as that worker power declined, it sort of exposed the latent, unchanging, monopsonistic nature of the labor market. So that's my personal take on the time series.
Yeah. Unions. And it's so cool. All right. So then I'll be cynical. So remote work from home. Yeah. Right. So here's a completely cynical take. If I am watching firms gleefully promoting work from home, I almost am inclined to think that they've figured out a way to use it to create higher switching costs so that they don't leave, so that they can extract more of the rents. I was curious, to what degree do you think that this remote work from home might appear to be advantageous to the worker, and in fact may actually just kind of be like what you were saying a little bit with the London premium, which is like on this one margin, there's this improvement, but on this other margin, is there something about it that I'm not guessing? Because it looks like a free lunch a little bit to the worker. I mean, it's like think about London, right? It's like it's so expensive to live in London. Well, I'm going to live like really far out beyond the green area that you said where it's really cheap, and I'm going to like get that London pay, that premium, and work from home. The fact that any firm actually wants to do this is just kind of giving me a little bit of some alarms.
Interesting. Well, I'm not sure I understand what the mechanism will be, how they extract the rent. So maybe you can.
No, I don't know either. I just like, this is kind of the horror story kind of thing. Like, there's something nefarious. Like, why would they want to do it? Why are they wanting to do it?
I think I'm more optimistic on remote work for most people. In that I think it's a benefit people really value. And if you look at work, Nick Bloom's work and other people's work on remote work, my colleague Erin Kelly, people really value remote work, and they're willing to pay a lot in terms of salary equivalent for having the option for remote work and for flexible work. And if you add on then the cost of living in big cities versus outside big cities, you're going to value it even more if you're able to leave, because then you're not paying a whole bunch of money in rent for something you don't intrinsically value, assuming that there are a lot of people for whom living in the big city.
Here's the mechanism.
Okay.
You get the same productivity, happier workers, and you pay them less.
Right. So then the question is, are you extracting rent or are you creating value? Are you leaving if the workers are better off and the firm is better off, in some sense, it's a value creating transaction, but maybe the firm gets a bigger share of the value than the worker. If the workers left the same and you cut their pay by exactly the increase in the welfare from the remote work, then I think the rents will go to the firm.
That's interesting. Right.
And then the question is, do they get passed on to a consumer or do they sit in the firm? And that's where the product market competition becomes important. So I think it'll be really interesting to see how it plays out, because also different companies are taking different stances right now about what they're doing with pay for remote work.
Yeah.
So some of them are saying they're adjusting pay to local cost of living, and some of them are saying they're not. And that's going to have to shake out at some point. I don't know how it's going to shake out.
Yeah.
But my sense is for the companies that are able to go fully remote, unless they're in very monopolistic product markets, a big share of that cost decrease must inevitably pass on at some point to consumers. So we're going to see some really interesting dynamics into which industries can do fully remote and which can't, and how that plays out, I think.
Yeah. I bet you get a bunch of some cost fallacy stuff at the firm though, like Apple. They're like, man, we just built this giant, it's like city headquarters. Y'all better come in. I can't rent this out to the local church or something. It's like,
it's true actually. Once you've got that kind of infrastructure, physical infrastructure in a place, it's very, very hard to go back from that.
Yeah. Well, it is so nice to meet in person and to learn more to talk more with you about your interesting work. Thank you for being on the episode.
Oh, it's so nice to talk. I really appreciate it. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah. Okay.